Continuing our look at one of the greatest, if not the greatest, world championship match in history, at least the most entertaining, Botvinnik versus Tal in 1960. Here we are at game 2, and Botvinnik has the white pieces and Tal has black. Let us jump right in for a game where Tal insists on an unbalanced position as soon as possible. Botvinnik plays d4, knight f6, c4, and c5, the very sharp opening that would come to later be known as the modern Benoni defense. I don't think they had that name at the time. E6, knight c3, ed5, cd5, and c6. And basically, white has one main plan in this position. Botvinnik wants to eventually play the move e5 and break in the center. That's his pawn break. He has a pawn majority in the center. Black has a lot of smaller plans that he can pick from. He better pick correctly, though. But the main idea, he wants to fianchetto his bishop and then use this 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side to advance and create problems for white. That's the ultimate strategy Black is usually looking for in this position. Knight to f3 from Botvinnik, g6. Again, that plan. I have a lot of lines here just illustrating some of the plans, but we'll move on from that. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, bishop to g7. One of the weaknesses, of course, for Black is this d6 pawn. Knight to d2. The knight wants to go to c4. In these Benoni structures, usually white would like to get a knight on c4 permanently, maybe play a4 and keep this b5 square under control so it can't be kicked out. h6, asking Botvinnik what he wants to do with that light-squared bishop. He maintains the pin, but then Tal plays g5. A sharp move, loosening the pawns in front of his king, but he wants that dark squared bishop off of the board. Now plays knight to h5, preparing to take that bishop off. Here, queen to a4 check was a possibility, but king to f8 maintains equality. The problem is the move bishop to d7, because then queen to e4 check. And now there's a problem defending this d6 pawn, and if Black plays queen to e7, white can just take on d6. So that was a possibility, but Botvinnik just goes ahead and plays knight to c4, piling onto this d6 pawn, and now knight takes g3. Tal acquires the two bishops early on, but he's paid a bit of a structural price in order to do that. But his dark squared bishop now has no opponent. Castling and e3. Basically, this f5 square is important. The knight wants to go to d7 and e5. Maybe play b6, bishop to a6 to deal with this knight on c4. It's a complex position. Queen to e7, bishop to e2. One of white's threats is to play knight to b5 and attack the d6 pawn twice with the knight on c4 and the knight on b5. That's what would happen if if Black just casually played the knight to d7. So here, Tal instead defends that pawn on d6 by playing rook to d8. White castles, and now knight to d7. And if the knight goes to b5, he can just play the knight to e5, so he's... And this pawn would be defended. If e5 is played here, the knight to e5, knight to e3, and white has a decent position. And again, this f5 square could become a problem for Black later on. But instead, a4, which is a much more standard move, trying to control the b5 square so Black cannot play b5 and eject this well-placed knight on c4. But knight to e5 is played. Black is more than happy to trade off the knight at c4 for his knight at e5, and that is what happens. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5. Tal did not like this move. He thought he should have taken with the bishop. He felt like the queen actually interfered with the bishop's activity in this decision. So after the game, he thought that was not the most precise. a5 is played by Botvinnik. Rook to b8, trying to get activity on the queen side, preparing to play b5. Rook to a2. The idea is the rook defends the b2 pawn. So this knight wants to be on c4. So the idea is to play knight b5, knight a3, knight c4. But in order to do that, he has to defend the pawn first, because otherwise Tal would just take it. That's the idea there. Bishop to d7, so that if the knight comes here, perhaps he'll chop it off so it can't continue that maneuver. White could play bishop to b5, and if bishop takes, knight takes, and white gets a good position because his knight is going to end up on c4. But queen to e8 could be played, trying to hold steady there. Queen to d3. and then bishop takes, and here we just get an equal heavy piece position. But after knight to b5, Tal goes ahead and chops off that knight. He does not want it landing on c4. And after Botvinnik played bishop takes b5, he offered a draw. But Tal turned it down. Again, and then he played the move b6, which wasn't the best move, as he said after the game. The stronger idea was to play a6, and then when the bishop moves, to play b5. And then this way you get queenside activity, enough to hold the game, most likely. You don't worry so much about these weak pawns. You just want to open up lines to attack. But by playing b6, Tal allows this move a6, and now his queenside play is really stymied. Everything is sort of blockaded, and has a hard time. He has a hard time getting activity. Rook b to c8. Perhaps he wants to play c4, c3 to open up some lines of attack. But Botvinnik, of course, sees that. He plays queen to d3, keeping the c4 square under control. The pawn cannot move forward. Rook to c7, perhaps wanting to go to e7. Now b3, adding to the control over the c4 square. But white does invite an exchange of queens, and Tal actually plays along. He decides to exchange queens, following the rule that the side with less space should seek to exchange pieces. So even Tal, who we know was a very strong player with queens on the board, is willing to exchange them here. Queen takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook to c2, and the bishop goes back to f6. And again, after the game, Tal felt he should have moved the bishop all the way back to g7 so he could play f5 and get some activity on the king side. But now g4 from Botvinnik, sort of locking down control of these f5 and h5 squares. Rook to e7 and rook to c4. As we mentioned at the beginning, white's main source of counterplay, he wants to play f4 and an eventual e5. Now, that's very hard to do here. It will require him to play g3, and really it's very hard to make that plan here, but at least he's going to try to do it. Rook to c8, g3, bishop to g7, rook to d1, defending the pawn at d5, rook to f8, hoping to get some activity by playing f5. Now rook to d3. Now notice there's actually an issue here where this bishop is can't retreat because these rooks are in the way, and that actually becomes an issue. King to h7, king to g2, and the rooks again interfere with that bishop at b5. King g6, and now rook to d1. Botvinnik realizes he needs to get that bishop back in the game. He also could have played b4, trying to gain some activity that way, but Tal plays h5, beginning to generate some activity. Maybe he can get some play on the h-file. Pawn takes, king takes. Now, in the game, Botvinnik played g4 check, but he had a very interesting move. It's the kind of move Botvinnik would never play, but Tal might. But the variations are quite interesting. It's this diabolical shot, rook to g4, which, by all appearances, just loses a rook. But that rook actually cannot be taken. If black takes that rook, then bishop to d3. And the threat is to just play f3 check, forcing the king back to h5, and rook to h1 would be mate. And in fact, the only way to stop that here is for black to give up his rook. So, and just take that pawn, because otherwise he's just toast. So the rook cannot be taken. The best move, of course, is just king to g6, and maintaining equality for black. But if he decides to play more aggressively with f5, that still is no good, because bishop d3 is still strong. And if he takes with the king here, then bishop e2 is checkmate. And if he takes with the pawn, then rook to h1 is checkmate. I thought this rook to g4 move was really a cool move. Whether it's a good decision in a practical game or not, it really leads to some interesting variations. But Botvinnik plays the much more pragmatic g4 check. The king goes back to g6, rook to c2, rook to h8, the open file, bishop to d3 check, king to f6 to get away from the check, king g3, rook e to e8, preparing so that this rook can also go to the h-file. Bishop to b5, hitting that rook, annoying it. But now the rook goes to e4, and the threat is to play rook to h4 and hit this g-pawn, and if f3 gets played, then e3 would be undefended. So Botvinnik neutralizes that as quickly as he can by playing rook to c4. The rooks are traded. Botvinnik takes with the pawn, and now we see these queenside pawns are very much locked, and we have opposite colored bishops. So after king to e7, bishop to a4, bishop to e5, check. King to f3, rook to h4 to just keep pressure on this g-pawn if the king moves away. So rook to g1 to defend it, f5. And in this position, with both sides' weaknesses completely covered, a draw was agreed. Really a victory for Tal because he had won with white, so now he was able to hold with black. A sample variation, say, is just bishop to d1. That holds everything. King to f6, bishop e2, and there's really no way to make progress. If he checks, you just go back and forth. So an interesting and entertaining draw in a sharp position in Game 2 of the World Championship between Botvinnik and Tal. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.